Everybody here tonight. My name is Julie Pavey Tomlinson, and I'm the Director of Environment and Parks here with the City of Port Moody. I'm an RP bio by training, so I'm a biologist, but we do have some very tree-like oriented people here with us tonight, including our city arborist, Brian Moffat. And I will introduce Amelia Niedeba, who's our project lead on this urban forest management strategy, and she works with Diamond Head Consulting. Amelia will go over where we're at in the process right now. There's actually 2 projects underway, but I just wanted to introduce her and welcome you all here tonight, and to let you know that we're trying to make this as website format friendly as possible. So we're actually tape recording it, so you don't have to worry about making notes. And as well, the boards that are outside, we'll make sure those PDFs are available on the website as well. So we're trying to make it easy for people who can make it in person or who are able to participate online, that they can just look at the stuff. So anyways, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Amelia, and we will be able to enjoy this lovely screen setup we have here in the Inlet Theatre. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to attend this evening. I'm going to provide about a 25-minute presentation, and then there'll be time for questions at the end, either in here or out there. So I will just jump right into it. The agenda for this presentation is going to cover just briefly a little bit of background on the project itself and where we're at with it, as well as a bit of a justification for why cities are developing urban forest strategies and really why we need trees in cities. As well, we'll cover a bit of the information and sort of results from what we learned through the process, and then I'll present an overview of the draft strategy itself. So the work on this project has occurred in 3 phases. It's run for about 18 months, and the first phase was really focused on getting an understanding of the context of Port Moody. So what are the values that the community has? What are the aspirations for the urban forest? What's the policy context today, and where would we like it to go? And then what's the kind of current state of the urban forest resource as well? As part of that work, we had an initial round of community engagement. And then once that was complete, we moved into developing the draft. And the draft is the outcome of that work that you now have before you to review. And once engagement's completed on this draft strategy, we'll move into finalising it in the summer. So Council has already provided some input on this through that sort of post the first phase of engagement, and that has given us some direction to sort of adjust our plan. You now see that one before you. Once engagement's complete, we'll finalise and we'll take it back to Council. So thinking through a bit about why we do these plans, and as urban foresters, our focus is to maximise the benefits that trees provide to communities. That's really what we're intending to do, and what these strategies are really aiming to achieve. We now have a situation globally where more than half of the world's population lives in cities, and that's projected to grow to 80% in the next few decades. And the recent IPCC report identified that cities have the greatest vulnerability to climate change impacts, particularly things like extreme heat, flooding, extreme weather events. But cities also have the greatest potential to adapt. And urban forestry is a really important part of that adaptation approach, as well as incorporating nature more generally into cities. And the reason for that is that trees and nature provide an enormous range of benefits. But when it comes to issues like extreme heat, trees provide shade, soils store water that cools the surrounding environment. We also know that trees are incredibly important in harbouring biodiversity in our cities. They improve, they intercept and store stormwater and improve water quality. And they also have a really significant impact on human health outcomes in cities. And there's a lot of research particularly in the last few years, that has come out on the connections between trees and access to nature and human health. Some of those reasons are really obvious in terms of just having nice places to walk, going outside on a warm day, or wanting to go out and enjoy the forest and being active. But other factors that have become very clear are in relation to cooling cities. So during the 2021 heat wave, there were 600 excess deaths. So 600 people essentially died as a result of the extreme heat that we experienced in 2021. And when the coroner looked at the factors that contributed to those deaths, the absence of vegetation within 100 metres was one of the factors that increased people's risk of mortality. So a recommendation from the coroner's report was that vegetation and tree cover be increased in areas where people are vulnerable to urban heat. Another study came out of Europe just this year as well, looking at their 2015 heat wave, and they found that if European cities increased their canopy cover average from 15% to 30%, that would have reduced the deaths in that heat wave by about 40%, so saved thousands of lives. So Europe, as a union, is working on urban forestry as one of its approaches to reducing risk to heat as well. And another study that came out this year from Portland found that people who lived in areas of higher tree canopy had higher life expectancy. And that held true not just in high-income areas, but across low-income areas with increasing canopy cover. They also saw increasing life expectancy. So even though we don't, fully understand all of the connections that are occurring to have these outcomes, there is just building evidence that having trees right in where people live, not just in parks or not just outside of cities, having trees right in cities is really critical. And that's a big focus of what this strategy is looking at, is how we can incorporate soil, incorporate trees into our urban areas to make sure that these benefits are available to people in Port Moody. So when we started this project, we also needed to understand what the current state was, what the extent of tree canopy was, how it's distributed, some information about the health of it, the number of street trees. These are all the types of metrics that are important in us understanding how we manage the resource. So we used LiDAR data from 2019. LiDAR is collected from an aircraft. It shoots a laser pulse down to the surface and it basically creates a 3D map of the ground. And then we combine that information with the orthophoto to establish where tree canopy exists. It gives us a very accurate map of tree canopy, essentially. And that yielded an estimate of 58% canopy cover for the city, which is very high compared to other lower mainland municipalities, and certainly an aspect of Port Moody that people really value. So although citywide canopy cover is 50%, it's actually quite a bit lower in the urban areas, the people where people live and work. So a lot of that canopy cover is held in regional parks and in municipal parks, or in these sort of industrial land uses that are forested as well. Now, part of that story is really good news in that all of that tree canopy in parks is a very stable area of tree canopy, so Port Moody is going to continue to have high canopy cover relative to other municipalities. However, in the urban area, it's quite a bit lower. And we want to see the canopy cover in the urban area growing and achieving a level where we're maximising the benefits from the urban forest. So a lot of the strategy's focus is going to be on how to increase canopy cover in those areas. I should also note that Metro Vancouver as a region has also set some canopy cover goals, and they've set a target to increase metro-wide canopy cover from 32% to 40%. So Port Moody is an important contributor to both maintaining and achieving that goal. I mentioned before the vulnerability to heat, and that being something that we're really increasingly focused on in urban forest strategies. We used satellite information from 2021 at the end of the June heat wave to map which parts of the city were hottest. And what really stood out were that the areas of lower tree canopy, of high impervious cover, those areas absorb and store more heat during these heat events and create quite a big, have quite a big temperature differential between the cooler parts of the city and the hotter parts of the city. So when we look at low canopy cover areas and urban heat areas, and then we combine that with some of the census information on demographics that contributes to that vulnerability, that can give us a sense of where we have parts of the city that really need more tree canopy cover compared to others. So this tree equity approach is based on a method that American Forests developed for the US, and we're essentially just using that method but using Canadian census data to combine it. And it develops a tree equity score. So areas with the lowest score have the lowest tree equity and highest need of more tree canopy. And so for Port Moody, some of the areas that are really highlighted there are the Port Moody Centre area blocks, as well as Glen Eyre, Seaview, College Park and Harbour Heights. These are just areas where in some cases trees might be young and they might have more canopy in the future, but in other cases there's a lack of trees and we need to increase tree canopy cover in these areas moving forward. Well, as I mentioned, we also went to the public and asked people to share with us, what their priorities were, what their values were related to the urban forest, and to help inform the vision and the strategies that we would put forward. So from the survey, people prioritised benefits related to climate mitigation and adaptation, environment and ecological benefits, and then recreation benefits. Those were really the ones that rose to the surface compared to sort of economic and cultural benefits. So those have really informed the vision and also just how the strategy is communicating the values through its various narratives. We also asked people to tell us a bit about what the character of streets they would like to see in the future and what character of streets they have today. So this survey question included a panel of 6 images, and then we asked people to tell us what their street was most similar to and then what they'd most like their street to look like in the future. So the blue bars here represent what people most commonly had in the city. So this sort of mixed spacing and sizes of trees that's represented in this photograph, that was the most common sort of character of streets that people who responded to the survey lived in. And then following that was sort of regularly spaced sort of medium trees or smaller trees or no trees, and some people had sort of larger sized mixed spacing trees as well. So a pretty forested character, but there are some subtle differences here when we ask people what they'd most like their streets to look like. Again, a lot of people were pretty happy with the mixed spacing and sizes of trees, but we see a real trend towards just more medium and large sized trees. So definitely people who have few or no trees or have small trees would prefer to see streets with larger trees. So as the city implements the strategy and goes to plant, we want to keep the character in mind, as well as that we want to try to provide space for medium and large canopy cover trees. We also asked people to share a bit about their level of satisfaction with the services that the city currently provides. So things like tree planting, tree protection, pruning, the typical activities that are involved in an urban forest management program. In this Likert scale, people were given the option to say if they were unsure as well. And so you can see from the grey tone, so quite a few people answered that they were unsure or neutral, which tells us, I think, that there could be more information shared about the program and what's involved in urban forest management, and really we could provide more information to people about what the city does, and that would probably improve people's understanding and ability to answer this question. There were a couple of responses that stood out to us. One being in terms of satisfaction, there was a bit more satisfaction with tree pruning and maintenance, so people had a bit more of a sense of that activity and how that was going. And people were a bit less satisfied with tree protection during development and public education. So those were just some takeaways for us that we used in informing some of the actions we developed. We also looked at the city's policy and how those policies were working to achieve outcomes in the urban forest, and identifying some gaps or some areas where updates could be made to kind of improve the outcomes. And then we use a set of criteria and indicators to assess, to develop this urban forest report card. We're sort of assessing where the city's at and where we want the city to go in the future, or where the city wants to go. Port Moody scored sort of fair to good along those rating scales, and those are really broad. They're focused on things like diversity of tree species and the tree planting program, and whether it addresses issues like equity and ecosystem services, all the way to policy that protects soils and sensitive ecosystems. So there's a lot in that, and a lot of work that the city is doing. But we're really using this to establish a baseline so that when the city comes and looks at this strategy again in 5 years, in 10 years, you can see where movements happened, where we've had success, and where we maybe things haven't moved. We can look at that, understand why, and then change the actions. And then the other context that we're keeping in mind, we've got the Port Moody context, but then we have these broader externalities, these issues that urban forestry is facing and that need to be addressed. So obviously climate change is having broad global and regional effects, but it's also impacting things right here in the city. So things like for how many years trees need to be watered to survive and establish. For things like declining cedar and hemlock, the cost of having to remove those trees, and then the need to restore areas where trees have been removed, and what types of species are we going to be planting into forests to ensure that they're resilient moving forward. So some big challenges there. Declining tree and forest health, that's definitely something that cities throughout our region are going to have to address, and that's going to have sort of flow-on impacts in terms of how often we need to do hazard tree assessments and the costs of tree removals and that same replanting. Issues related to urban development. So urban development provides both opportunities for us to increase canopy cover as well as challenges in terms of retaining existing trees. So how, through this strategy, can we achieve the best outcomes for either retention or replacement where retention isn't possible? And then finally, program capacity and adaptive capacity. We know that Port Moody has a comparatively small population relative to all the trees that are being managed in the community. So what types of approaches are appropriate to match the city's capacity to the outcomes we can achieve? And where do we need to increase capacity to meet levels of service that the community is expecting, but also to be able to have a storm event occur, be able to respond and not have it derail the program for the whole year. So those are the kinds of issues that we're thinking about as we develop recommendations. So the strategy itself is structured around an overarching vision and then 5 main goals that really are focused on the areas of work for urban forest management. And then each of those has a set of strategies and actions underneath it. The vision is that Port Moody's abundant, safe and resilient urban forest supports the health and well-being of our community and the exceptional environment in which we live. So that vision is trying to capture the values that we heard as well as the aspirations for the future and the ongoing sort of abundance and health. In thinking about how canopy cover is distributed and the types of trees in Port Moody, we really note the sort of varied context that trees exist within. So we have these really natural areas in parks and in ravines, and then we have these very highly urbanised areas where trees are growing in pavement and largely containerised. So when we're thinking about the strategy and what kind of canopy cover could be in the future of it, we need to understand what the capacity is for these different types of land uses to receive trees, and as well then what are the strategies we need for those trees to thrive and be healthy. And that's very different for a tree growing in a park compared to a tree growing in a highly urbanised environment. So the strategies really try to get at the outcomes that will maximise, again, the health and resilience of trees in each of these types of settings. And so thinking through where there is, space or room for improvement in terms of tree canopy in Port Moody, that was really what we used to develop our scenarios for future tree canopy cover. And that focus is largely on increasing canopy cover in the urban area, because we know that in parks and in these sort of more forested land uses, it's going to be relatively stable. But we know that in the urban area, it's lower than we'd like it to be, and it's also where a lot of the future development and change is going to happen. So that's a real area of focus for future canopy expansion. So in seeking to set a canopy cover goal, we looked at three main scenarios. We started with the status quo. What do we think is going to happen to the tree canopy cover if we keep things as they are? And this is projected forward to 2050. So it's not a really long time period. It's quite a short time period in the terms of how long it takes a tree to mature. So we've kept that in mind when looking and projecting forward. So in terms of the status quo, we know that there is going to be a certain amount of canopy cover change as a result of intensification and infill as we move forward. We've done our best work to sort of estimate what we think that will be moving forward. And then we've looked at the current planting rates across the city and then projected what we think that would yield in terms of future canopy cover. And we think what would happen is that there'd be just quite a gradual sort of decline through that time period. And in part, that's simply because of the time it takes for trees to mature. So although we're planting trees, they're not growing at a rate that's going to offset the canopy cover loss. For scenario 2, the no net loss, we then looked at, well, what would we need to do in order to keep canopy cover stable and offset those losses in that time frame to 2050? And we identified that we'd roughly need to triple the rate of tree planting in order to achieve that outcome, and we'd have to look at various strategies for doing that. So part of it would be through planting that happens with development, part of it would be through street tree planting, and part of it would be through private land planting and partnerships and asking people to plant more trees on their properties. And then scenario 3 was really looking at, well, what would we need to do to not just keep things steady, but actually grow the canopy cover? And that sort of just amps up everything in scenario 2 again. We have to essentially double down on those efforts. And you can see that overall, the citywide canopy cover isn't changing a great deal between those scenarios. Really where we're seeing the change is in that urban area. So scenario 2, it's increasing canopy cover from about 28% to 31%. And then scenario 3, it's raising from 28% to 35%. So that's really where the differences are coming in. We've recommended scenario 2 based on a scenario that we think is both achievable but also quite ambitious. It does represent a significant increase in the level of investment required, and it does also require some changes in policy as well. We've also recommended scenario 2 rather than scenario 3, just based on that sort of adaptive capacity piece. We want the trees that we put in the ground to be able to be maintained, to survive and thrive. And so sometimes it's not just about planting as many as you can, but more about getting quality and ensuring that you can achieve those outcomes. And we feel that scenario 2 is the most feasible way for the city to achieve that. So as I mentioned, the strategies are built around these 5 goals, and these 5 goals are driven towards achieving that canopy cover target and achieving that vision. I'll run through these briefly here. So the plan and adapt goal is really thinking about that kind of citywide context. How do we integrate urban forest management across departments and across the different initiatives to really make sure we're achieving co-benefits? So it's not just about increasing tree canopy, it's also about intercepting stormwater and helping to achieve stormwater objectives. It's also about helping to achieve streetscape outcomes for active transportation with shaded streets. We want all these things to be integrated so that the investment's really producing the benefits that we're looking for. We also need to monitor progress and make changes if the strategy isn't working. And we need to make sure that the resources are sufficient to actually implement the strategy as well. The plant goal is more focused on the quality of the environments that we're putting trees into, so making sure that those environments can support healthy, long-lived trees. That's going to be the most cost-effective way of achieving maximal benefits. We also want to plant more trees than we have been in the past. We want to enhance ecosystems, and we want to make sure that that tree canopy is going where it's needed to increase tree equity and meet our canopy cover targets. And we want to improve the quality and suitability of those trees. So we're planting the right tree in the right place, but we're also choosing the right species for long-term survival. The managed goal is more focused on the operational side of things. So how is the city managing tree risk? What are the maintenance standards that we're setting, and how can we improve current maintenance standards to meet the targets that we've set? And then how can we improve the climate resilience of urban forest management so that we have that adaptive capacity? The protect goal is more looking at factors that influence how trees are retained or how soil is retained throughout the city. So one of the strategies there is to review and update the tree protection bylaw, and that's a process that's currently underway. So there is a survey out about the tree protection bylaw at the moment. And there will be a key directions report that's put forward that the public will also have a chance to provide additional input on. We also, through the strategy, are going to look at other types of policy tools, because it's not just tree bylaws, it's also things like zoning, development permit areas. These are various tools that cities have that regulate land use, and the space for trees is regulated by those types of land use decisions. So that's also another key area that the strategy is focused on. And then we also need better ways of making decisions about when trees are removed or when trees are replaced. So there's also some guidance in there on how we should move forward in understanding when we need to make decisions to prioritise active transportation or the urban forest or affordable housing. These kinds of issues are all relevant and they're all important, but we do need to have some frameworks for how we decide when we make one a higher priority over another. And then the final goal is focused on partnerships. So that's really recognising that this strategy isn't just a city initiative. A lot of the city's land base is not even under the city's sort of direct control. So how are we going to partner to implement the strategy? There's really three core areas here. One being focused on building relationships and opportunities for reconciliation. So how can we bring First Nations perspectives into land management and use that to both improve reconciliation but also enhance the health of the urban forest as well. And then the second there being to broaden the community partnerships. And that's with schools, with residents, sort of across the board there to implement the urban forest strategy. And then how can we also build connections between people and the natural environment? Because fostering those connections is really what's building stewards for the future and ensuring that these types of values are going to be upheld as our children become the leaders of tomorrow as well. So that really summarises the content of the strategy, and just briefly I'll touch on the next steps. You hopefully have already seen and become aware of this event tonight through Engage Port Moody. As I mentioned, there's two surveys up there at the moment that we're asking people to review. One is the Urban Forest Management Strategy. Once that closes on June 25th, we're going to move into finalising the strategy, and then it will go to council. But the tree protection bylaw review will still be ongoing. So once that survey closes, as I mentioned, we'll prepare a key directions report, and there'll be another phase of engagement on that. And then we'll present the results of that engagement and what we're proposing as a draft bylaw to council following that. So I will leave it at that. Thank you for listening through that, and I'd be happy to answer questions here or outside afterwards. Sure, I'll tackle that one first. So essentially, how in these really highly urbanised areas where the corridors are very narrow, are we actually going to practically achieve increases in canopy cover? So these highly urbanised areas, are certainly present a lot of challenges or constraints, I should say, in terms of the tree canopy that can be planted into those types of locations. There are some technologies that at least allow us to provide below ground root space. Those are things called soil cells or suspended pavement systems. So they'd be ways of having soil under the ground and still having a pavement or a load-bearing surface on top, but having enough soil underneath that you can actually support a healthy tree that can live a long life. The other part is the above ground consideration, and that really comes down then to the species selection. So we're not going to have necessarily, or unless we change the way the road is configured, we're probably not going to have the large spreading canopy trees in that kind of example, but we can at least have some sort of narrower canopy trees that still provide some benefit, but they're not providing the arching, closing canopy that, many of us are fond of. But those types of technologies are really the only option we have to provide healthy trees in highly urbanised areas. And I don't know, Julie, did you want to add anything to that for those specific locations?
Add a little bit. One of the areas that we've had some recent tree removals on was on St. John's, where we're having a multi-use path built, and looking at how trees will go back into that space and to accommodate them and looking at the right species. A lot of it actually does come down to the soil, which you've heard a lot of today, and that's because that's where we see a lot of the challenges is trees that are not doing well because they don't have adequate soil volumes. They require more watering. They struggle during these heat waves. And so making sure that the planting is
Can you hear me better like that? Yes, okay. So in College Park, I can see that we are losing some very old tall trees, and because they were growing as a group, quite often what's left exposed is much more prone to damage by any storm that comes. And people also are concerned that some of those single, very few trees left of the denser former situation are going to be endangering their homes. So quite recently, quite a few trees were taken out by single people, I would say private owners, and also a lot of bigger trees were taken out with the development of near Cecil and Angela Drive. So my question is, as a homeowner having certain trees on my property, how can I seek some guidance whether that it's safe to stay with those trees, for how long my neighbors are concerned? Should I be asking just for permit to remove the tree and, plant some small shrubbery or grass and never see a tall tree again? Could we have some sort of I don't know, access maybe to your services that you could run, I don't know, once a year, maybe a survey and say this tree can stay, this can go, this is, that we know how to go about maintaining whatever we can and preserving those trees and protecting them. Thank you.
I mean, typically the city wouldn't inspect trees on private property.
Use the mic. Microphone. Can you guys hear me back there? Or is I quiet too?
Yeah, we can hear you.
How's that? Can you hear me? Yeah. Typically the city wouldn't inspect trees on private property. We would leave that to the residents to do. We don't have the resources available.
No, but just knowing how is it available. Like, for example, if your service or somebody like you
Like
would be
recommendations
available, yes, then it's going to cost me, I don't know, $100 and you're going to come and have a look.
I mean, I think definitely we can improve our content on our website to include some help and resources for residents in situations like that.
Diamond Head has some great artworks too.
She's not going to say anything when it's her presentation, but yeah,
No,
we do have
but-
just to let you know, the only thing I would say about arborists, and we're trying to have some enhanced education, is there are some people out there that sometimes get involved in tree work who are not arborists, and we would highly recommend you get a proper arborist do the work. There's a professional standard that they have to follow. There's a lot of considerations for it, and we would want to have, we don't want to have people put themselves in a risk way for an arborist assessment. We have to manage, I think you saw on the boards, we have 4,400 trees on boulevards alone for us to manage, and we're looking at like inspection cycle frequency and how we go about inspecting them as well, and we use only arborists for our work as well. And generally it does help, like, in having a proper program. The other thing was that sometimes if you have an arborist involved, there may be a tree that needs some corrective pruning or some remedial work. You can then keep the tree safely if you do the work, but if you don't know about the problem until it's too late, then sometimes the tree will have a health issue because they are a living biological entity, so they can have problems too. So we've seen that before where our staff have gone out taking a tree that's got some issues, and then they're just like, let's give this a shot, we're going to monitor it, we're going to do some stuff and see if we can help it. That happens as well. Proper pruning, proper like topping, for instance, is not recommended. There's a ton of literature out there about that, so we can try to share stuff like that because you create future tree health issues. So.
And we do have those resources on the city website, some of those resources already, but maybe we could put together a guide to what to look for in an arborist or a tree person.
Is there any funding available from the province to support this? Like, I saw recently there's grants available from the city for things like heat pumps for residents, but are there grants available for arborists to come in to help maintain trees?
Yeah, it's a great question. Some communities are starting to do that, and I think that's certainly a program that we would typically recommend cities consider, is that, especially in relation to having a bylaw that might require people to keep larger trees, is that come with a grant program to help support some of the costs of the maintenance.
Especially because if it's, you've got the data that expert tree cover would save on a lot of costs, say, associated with medical issues during heat waves or, deaths, things like that, that you would think this is actually a money saver for the province and the city. So
I can speak, I'll speak loudly. We have actually tapped into grant programs in the past for tree planting. We've done a fairly ambitious planting with
Sorry, did you say rooftop trees then? Yeah. They are, and they are a component, but if you think about it as a hierarchy of sort of maximum benefit, you know, the biggest benefit and the lowest cost comes from a tree in the ground, and trees on structure are kind of at the bottom of that. And that's largely because of the fact that building membranes need to be replaced. There's a higher frequency of replacement and a higher cost that goes into those landscapes. So, but yes, it certainly is, you know, green walls, green roofs, trees on structure are definitely an important component of greening in urban areas. But from an urban forest perspective, we would ideally like to see the trees, the ground, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah.
With the recommended strategy of no net loss, has there been any analysis or discussion about how that would impact from a budget perspective? You know, the city does an amazing work with the limited resources they have, but to successfully implement that, something significant has to happen. And has that analysis been done, and can that be communicated to people who make the decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say the analysis is in process. So we did the kind of costing. We have a sense, and we're sort of refining those numbers down. And it'll also be part of a periodic budget process. Essentially, these things will be, you know, staged, and there'll be recommendations around when they're introduced to make it, you know, again a feasible kind of implementation.
Legislatively, what are the benefits of expanding tree protection into the zoning bylaw and the subdivision development servicing bylaw as opposed to focusing the efforts on the tree protection bylaw?
Yeah, it's a great question. From our perspective, those bylaws like the zoning bylaw and subdivision bylaw that regulate land use are should be the foundation. They should be the starting point because they control whether there's space for a tree or there isn't. So that's definitely, you know, I would say as important as changing the tree bylaw. The tree bylaw is sort of the last piece of the puzzle. I guess once you have the space for the trees, the tree bylaw sits there and ensures that trees are protected or replaced as they sort of cycle through. But I'd say all three are critical to actually effective urban forest management. Sorry.
Something that I was looking at as we went through, and I was happy to see it finally at the very end when it talked about partnerships and an opportunity for reconciliation initiatives. With it just very briefly at the end, are there connections being made? Is that being worked on? And do we have a realistic hope of that happening?
Yeah, actually, we're working in a truth and reconciliation process overall on a number of strategies. This is one of them. It's been referred to all 7 nations that are rights holders within our area, and then they are telling us how they want to be involved with us. So rather than coming out and doing the stakeholder engagement approach with it, we're actually going through a different process parallel with it and finding out how they want to be involved and how they want to partner rather than supposing it. So yeah, it's in process. It's been going in parallel, because there's a lot of knowledge there. There's definitely from a number of nations now we've gotten their indigenous planting lists and things like that as well. So just incorporate some traditional knowledge into it is really important, as well as a cultural sense of place. So we did speak a bit about the human health things, but there's also a whole placemaking and cultural sense of place. And obviously for First Nations have been here for a long, long time, that their sense of place sometimes is related to the trees, and they have their own values.
Julie mentioned wholesale buying as one way to make it easier to replant some canopy cover, probably on private land as well. Are there other examples in Metro Vancouver or elsewhere of incentives for private property owners to plant on their property?
Yeah, great question. There's a few different models out there. So some are the kind of tree sales and tree giveaways that we've seen where trees are provided very cheaply, usually in combination with some education about planting. There is some potential for that 2 billion trees funding to maybe eventually go a bit towards a private land program. And if that happened, that would be great, because it would mean across the region there was like an aggregator that would support municipalities in getting those trees to their residents. There's also other types of incentives, like so there's something called a stormwater utility tax. City of Victoria actually has one, and basically you pay more tax for stormwater utility if you have more impervious surface. So you're incented to have more pervious cover. And in the States, there's a number of cities that give credits for planting a tree into that as well. And Victoria is looking at that but hasn't implemented it yet. But those kinds of direct relationships, I think, are really powerful in promoting, pervious surface is a great beginning because you can put a tree in it, but those are the types of programs that we'd like to see more of throughout Canada. That's great. Oh, one more. Yeah.
So I didn't catch the first part of the presentation and haven't had a chance to read the report, so you can tell me to go look it up. But I was wondering if you've considered also, when you're thinking about species, if you've considered edible, trees that produce food versus ornamental trees.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it isn't really, it's terribly explicit in the strategy. Usually from an urban forest perspective with the food forest element, that comes in as part of the community partnerships, because it's really essential for fruit trees that they need to be cared for in a particular way and maintained in a certain way, and the fruit needs to be harvested. So any kind of broader initiative to add edible trees in the landscape is something that often is done in partnership with a community group who agrees to kind of manage and take care of that. In terms of Port Moody, you guys did you want to add to any sort of specific approach to food forests?
One thing that we have to think about in Port Moody, we do have some guidelines around this. We do have, obviously we deal with fair attractants, that type of thing, so we do have guidelines around each species to deal for food. And then obviously people, if they have a fruit tree and they're not picking up their fruit, then they'll attract bears in. So there is a companion piece to that, the human bear conflict plan. But food forests in general, I think with management and the right planning and stuff like that, definitely maybe part of the community desire, but that is then definitely partnerships. We don't have a specialist on our team doing that kind of work.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for those great questions as well. Let us know what you think of the plan.